Hello, this is Professor James Strickler, and this is a course in American government. This lesson is from Unit 10 about media and politics. It's Lesson 7 about media power. In this lesson, you'll learn about how the media acts as a linking mechanism. You'll learn about media agenda setting and about the media engaging in issue framing. So let's begin by asking an important question, and that is, how much does the media actually influence what we believe? In this lesson, we're going to take one side of that question. We're going to talk about reasons to believe that the media actually does have power over what we believe. In the next lesson, we'll take the other side and talk about reasons to believe why the power of the media might actually be limited in this way. But as we think about why we might believe that the media has power over what we believe, we're going to look at three different aspects of this, three different ways in which they might be exercising power over our beliefs. The first of those is where the media acts as a linking mechanism. Now, what is meant by the media being a linking mechanism? To understand that, let's build a diagram that can help explain it to us, beginning with the general public. Now, the general public, as we engage in our lives, there's lots of things that we're concerned about. We may be worried about events involving our family, or the place we work, or the place we worship. Those things fill lots of our attention. And while we're paying attention to those things, there are political events taking place also. But those are more distant. We oftentimes do not have personal contact with them, the same way that we have with our family members, or our work environment, or our church group, or whatever other thing it is that's directly affecting our lives. Politics may seem distant. Just to take an extreme example, you've probably never met President Obama, but somehow you're aware of President Obama. Matter of fact, you probably know quite a bit about President Obama. Well, how does that happen? How can you actually be connected in some ways to something so distant and separate from your everyday life? That's where the media comes into play. They're the ones who take those those political events and somehow place them in our lives. So, for example, President Obama may give a speech. The media then presents that speech to us, or at least parts of it, so that we, the general public, can be aware of what the president said in that speech. That's what it means for the media to be a linking mechanism. So as a linking mechanism, the media connects us, the general public, with the political world, including the politicians and what they say. So this is really important to recognize, that without the media there to make that connection for us, we would generally be unaware of what politicians are doing, generally unaware of what some distant government is doing. We need that connection, and the media provides it. Okay, the second way that the media might have an influence over what we believe is not by simply connecting us to political actors, but also doing something called agenda setting. Now, this is actually related to this linking mechanism that we already talked about. Let me explain how. The linking mechanism that we described just a moment ago is this notion that political events take place, and we as the general public are separated from them, but the mass media connects us to them in some way. They're aware of these political events, and then they report them to us, basically. But that simplified model doesn't take into account the fact that there are lots and lots and lots of events out there taking place. And all of them are competing for the media's attention. And the media simply doesn't have the time or space to cover all of them. In other words, to inform us as a public of everything that's happening out there. In fact, even as the media is themselves probably only aware of part of what's happening in the world, they then make a choice to only pass on part of that information to us. So I want you to notice what's happening here. This is why this linking mechanism is so important. Because they are the ones who make us aware of what's happening in the political world. If they only make us aware of some of those things, those are the only things that we end up aware of. So really, we could perhaps describe this linking mechanism better as a filtering mechanism, where they're going to decide what's important enough for us to know about and leave the rest out. It's this filtering mechanism process that we call agenda setting. Through agenda setting, the mass media then chooses which events they think we should be aware of. Now, it's called agenda setting because if you think about, if you go to a meeting, there might be an agenda for that meeting. It's the list of things that are going to be covered by the meeting. Now, there's probably many, many other things that could potentially be discussed in a meeting, but the ones that are important enough to be discussed get on the agenda. Well, the media does that for us in regard to news, and particularly we're focused on political news. So there's many, many, many things out there that they could potentially tell us about, but then they choose which ones they think are important enough to actually tell us about. And in doing this, they then limit what we are aware of. Because they didn't tell us about everything, and they had to pick a few things, we only end up generally aware of the things that the media has decided are important enough to tell us about. Agenda setting is sometimes called the CNN effect. Now, this name has a very specific origin. Back in 1980, a guy named Ted Turner started a new kind of television station. He called it the Cable News Network, where they would cover news 24 hours a day. Now, there are multiple channels in our modern America that do this, but when he started this in 1980, it was a revolutionary concept, and it was one that had some difficulties in implementing. The first of those was, how are you going to fill up 24 hours in a day with news? You need something to actually put in that time, and it needs to be something that people will find interesting, that they will find compelling, that they'll want to tune in and watch over and over again, perhaps. Well, what sort of story are you looking for then? Well, we talked before in a previous lesson about media imperatives. It could be something about conflict or scandal or that sort of thing. It can also be something that pulls at people's heartstrings. And CNN, early in its history, found just such a story. It was a famine that was taking place in Ethiopia. People, including little children like in this picture, were starving to death. It was a heart-wrenching thing to tell people about. And CNN sent cameramen there to film it and show it to the world. Now, while they were there filming it, though, and paying attention to it at this time period, we have to realize that this wasn't the only famine that Ethiopia had ever had or would ever have. In fact, Ethiopia has experienced famines in 1958, in 1966, in 1973, and then again during the years 1984 and 1985. That's when CNN was around to pay attention. And CNN realized that these images drew viewers. People were upset about what was happening in Ethiopia, and they turned in to watch. This got them ratings, and so they basically ran stories about the Ethiopian famine 24 hours a day, day after day. You couldn't get away from it. Once CNN was paying such close attention to it, people started talking about it, and then other people started paying attention to it too, until it became a giant worldwide story with a giant worldwide reaction. Now notice though, as I said already, this wasn't the first time a famine had happened in Ethiopia. It was just the first time that CNN was obsessing over covering it. The result was a worldwide outpouring of desire to help the victims of the famine. The most visible result of this was a giant worldwide concert held by bands at venues spread around the globe, with the proceeds going to famine relief in Africa. This concert was known as Live Aid. Now, realize that Live Aid would not have happened if CNN hadn't had 24 hours a day to fill with news and figured out that showing the famine in Ethiopia was a way to fill it. CNN directly caused the world to pay attention to this crisis in ways that they had not paid attention to previous famines. From this, we learned that saturation coverage, like you get with 24 hours news programs, can create large reactions from people. Large reactions to things that they otherwise might not have noticed. So the media, being a linking mechanism, puts them in a place then to set the agenda like this. Now, this doesn't mean that they're telling us what to think, but it means that they can tell us what to think about. When they start paying a lot of attention to something, the rest of us pay a lot of attention to it too. The third way that the media potentially can be exercising power over what we believe is through something called issue framing. To understand this, again, let's go back to the idea of the media being a linking mechanism. So there's these political events, the media pays attention to them, and then they pass the stories on to us. Now, we already talked about how they have to set the agenda by choosing among these political events which they will share with us. But even after they've made that choice, they have additional influence. Because when they make the choice to cover some political event, there is a tremendous amount of information coming into them, and they simply don't have the time or space to pass it all on to us. So what they do have to do is whittle it down. They can't tell us all the facts, so they have to choose some of the facts to pass along. And then what they end up doing is summarizing the other things. And that may not even be sufficient. So then they end up having to explain and interpret what they've told us. So they take a story, a bunch of events that they're aware of, and then somehow they condense them down to tell us, and along the way, they may end up changing some of what the story is really about. So, perhaps rather than calling the media a linking mechanism, it might be better to describe it as an interpreting mechanism, where they don't just pass along plain facts to us, but they have to embellish them in some way in order to help us understand, because they can't tell them all to us, and they have to pick and choose which ones, and so they have to fill in the holes of the explanation with their own ideas. This interpreting mechanism is what we call issue framing. Now, the reason that term is used to describe this, it's the idea that you're viewing the world through a frame, like a frame around a window. And that window is there because the media put it up through their agenda setting. But they put it in a particular place with a particular view. And so when you look out through that window, you see what it is that the media wanted you to see about this particular thing. Where if they'd put the window at a different spot, you would have seen a different view of things. Let me give a real-world example to help you understand this better. Back in 2012, there was an unfortunate death of a young man that caused a lot of controversy in the United States of America. This man was named TRAYVON Martin. Now, what happened with TRAYVON was he was with his father, and they went to visit his father's girlfriend. The girlfriend lived in a neighborhood that TRAYVON Martin was not familiar with. Well, he left the girlfriend's house and went to a nearby convenience store to get a snack. And when he walked back into the neighborhood, it being his first time visiting there, he wasn't really sure which house it was that he was supposed to be going back to. So he ended up wandering back and forth up and down the street. It was dark, it was raining. He was kind of looking around at all the houses. Frankly, he looked suspicious. And there was a man out patrolling the neighborhood as part of the neighborhood watch, a man named George Zimmerman, who spotted TRAYVON Martin doing this. And he became suspicious. There had actually been break-ins previously in the neighborhood. He ended up confronting TRAYVON Martin, and they ended up in a fight. As the fight proceeded, TRAYVON Martin ended up on top of George Zimmerman, pounding his head on the sidewalk. But George Zimmerman was armed, and he pulled out a gun and shot TRAYVON Martin. This upset a lot of people, and the media covered the story extensively. Now, I want to show you something about how they covered it, and how this shows how issue framing can take place. Here you have two pictures of TRAYVON Martin and of George Zimmerman. Now, if you look at only these pictures and try to wonder who was right and wrong in this case, who was the real troublemaker that caused the fight and caused the death, you might well reach the conclusion that TRAYVON Martin was an innocent party, because he certainly looks innocent in this photograph. You might reach the conclusion that George Zimmerman is some troublemaking criminal thug because, well, frankly, he looks a little dangerous here, and he appears to be wearing what looks like an orange prison jumpsuit. But there are other photos of these two men also. Now look at these photos. I apologize that there's an obscene gesture in the one, but these are photos of the same two people, and they give a far different impression. Now, if you look at these photos, George Zimmerman looks like an upstanding member of the community, maybe a businessman, while TRAYVON Martin looks like the troublemaker as he flips off the camera. Well, when the media reported this story, they had to make choices about how they were going to present these two men. And for the most part, as they presented the story, they used the two top photos to do so, which made it then look like George Zimmerman was some out-of-control person who probably caused the fight, and he was unjustified in killing innocent little TRAYVON Martin. Well, that was a good way for the media to present the story, to generate controversy, which, as we talked about in a previous lesson, then generates them money. But they could have presented it the other way around using the other photos. They could have presented it as TRAYVON Martin, the troublemaking hothead. George Zimmerman is the upstanding member of the community who simply stopped to question this man, what he's doing, and ended up being attacked by him. They could have presented it that way. And those choices were made or not made simply by which photos they choose to represent these two people. So through issue framing, the media presents to us only certain aspects of a story. And in doing that, they may lead us to see the story in a certain way. And this gives them power over what our opinions of that story then are. Now, let's review what we learned in this lesson. What does it mean that the media is a linking mechanism? Does it mean that the news organizations share information with each other? Does it mean that people switch news sources? Does it mean that the media connects people with their government? Or does it mean that the media gives up secrets? It means that the media connects people with its government. That's the linking being done between the government or other political actors and the general public. That's who the media is connecting together. What does the media do when agenda setting? Are they following public opinion? Are they determining their show lineups? Or are they deciding what stories to cover? Or are they buying access to politicians? When agenda setting, the media is deciding what stories it will or will not cover. And this is important because if they don't cover a story, we don't know about it. If they do cover a story, they may cause us to pay attention to something we otherwise would not. What does the media do when issue framing? Is that them creating a multi-part story? Or is it them failing to gain an audience? Or are they deciding what facts to share with us? Or are they making excuses for bad stories? When the media is issue framing, it's deciding what facts to share or not share, thus causing us to see the story in a certain way or to not see it in a certain way. That completes this lesson. The next lesson will also be from Unit 10. It'll be Lesson 8 about what limits there may be on the power of the media to influence what we believe.